Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of the HLF online sessions. Thank you for being with us this evening. And for this evening, I have great pleasure in introducing to you Professor Sherry Simon. And she's joining us from Canada. And before I introduce Professor Sherry Simon, let me quickly make a couple of announcements. On my own behalf and on behalf of my fellow directors of Hyderabad Literary Festival, I have pleasure in announcing that our next session on 4th of September will be with Michael Bass, who is the author of the very recent book which was released last week. This is a book called Muscular India, Mobility and the New Middle Class. So this is a book that will be in focus next 15 days from now. And as you know by now, we are doing these online sessions once in 15 days. And so we'll be back with you 15 days from now on 4th of September. Please also subscribe to the HLF YouTube channel and also click on the bell icon so that you get notifications every time we go online. So with these few preliminary announcements, I have great pleasure in introducing to you Professor Sherry Simon. Professor Sherry Simon is Distinguished University Research Professor in the French Department at Concordia University, Montreal, Canada. She writes about language and memory in cities as varied as Montreal, Barcelona, Trieste, and Calcutta. Her best-known books include Translating Montreal, Cities in Translation, Gender in Translation, and the book in focus today, Translation Sites, a Field Guide. Just to quickly introduce the book to you, for those of you who are perhaps have not had the time to look up the book, Translation Sites is a book that shows how the processes and effects of translation pervade contemporary life. The book explores a range of public spaces like hotels, markets, gardens, bridges as sites of translation. The book breaks new ground by connecting translation studies and memory studies, urban geography, and architecture and history. Congratulations, Sherry, on your new book. I know this is already a year old now, I suppose.
Yes.
And I'm sure you have received a lot of feedback about this book already. And we are delighted to welcome you back to HLF, where you participated, I think, a few years ago in Hyderabad. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this session for us this evening. And I particularly look forward to your insights into translation as a field and also your very unusual connection between cities and translation. If you don't mind, I would, yes, thank you very much. If you don't mind, I would like to begin with somewhat a personal question. Some of my questions are in a way colored by our present context in India, where we had a new education policy, which has just been accepted by the cabinet. And one of the things that this new education policy talks about is early education in the mother tongue. And of course, the policy makes quite a confused kind of inclusion of mother tongue as home language, as local language. You know, it treats the three as if they are synonymous. So I would like to begin by asking you, what is your mother tongue and what is your home language and what is your local language?
Thank you. That's a very interesting and lovely entry point. Yes, the whole notion of mother tongue, as we know, over the last 20, 30 years has become so confused. I very much like the expression that's used by a Cypriot poet who talks about stepmother tongue. He, in the context of Cyprus, as you know, which is a very fraught situation between Turkish and Greek. He enjoys talking about how his favorite language, the language that he writes in, the language that he's adopted, is in fact his stepmother tongue rather than his mother tongue. So taking away the idea of naturalness in language, that you have a natural connection with some language, because more and more all over the world, that connection to language is not a natural one. There are so many migrants who, here in Canada, our population is more migrant than native. There are, more people who have arrived in this country over the last well, at least in certain cities, let's say, in cities like Toronto. So people who are living between languages and I can say enjoying or profiting from the space between languages are more and more numerous. So there's no question that the notion of that the assumption that local language equals native language equals mother language is more and more difficult across the world. And I think this is an interesting and good development. It's a development that may complicate educational policy, but it is a good development. And the idea of translation sites, in fact, speaks to that, very, very much speaks to that reality, that the places that we live in, that the places we visit, that the places we honor and remember somehow exist between languages.
Yeah. So your home language, I assume, is English, and yet you studied French and you teach French. So how did that come about?
Yes, I'm very much a product of my home city, the city that I write a lot about, and that which has taken on a sort of a larger, has become a kind of a template for me. So my home city is Montreal. The Montreal I grew up in was very much a divided city. I wouldn't say an apartheid city. That would be, that's very much exaggerating it, but it was a city where languages were separate. My home language that I grew up with was English, but it was a fairly recent English because my grandparents were immigrants to this country. So it was an English, but, not a kind of English that has these very, very strong roots. It was a superficial kind of English. And very early, I was attracted to the other side of town. So there was a kind of a fraught relationship because a kind of more of a colonial relationship between the two sides of the city. So I lived in the west side, and there the predominant language was English. But there was a huge territory out there that was French. And as a child, I enjoyed taking buses and taking risks, I could say, by traveling across town without my parents' knowledge. I don't know why I decided they shouldn't know, but I didn't want them to know. And I'd just hop on a bus and feel what it was like to be on the other side of town in a place that spoke a different language, where I did not feel necessarily welcome at all. I felt like I was a bit of an intruder. But there was a kind of excitement to that too, because there's a kind of a thrill to transgression. And the pull of that other language was very strong. So I did learn French, and I went to, in those days, a very typical colonial situation. I actually had to go to Paris, France, to learn French so that I could come back to my city and feel at home on the French side. So from then on, I began to participate. I married a French Canadian. I brought my children up in French. So
So their mother tongue would be French.
Their mother tongue is French. Yes.
Yeah, and also to,
of course.
Sorry.
They speak English, of course.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
their mother tongue is French. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Expanding on the same idea. See, Canada has an officially bilingual. Canada is officially bilingual, but I'm sure socially it has many more languages. In the sense, including the languages of the First Nations and the languages of the diasporic communities, and so on. So, give us a sense of how does this bilingualism, operate in Canada? Is it a kind of a peaceful coexistence, or is it a contestation, if not conflict?
So languages on the same territory are automatically in a situation of tension. It's very difficult to imagine a situation where languages exist peacefully. So we will take that, let's say, as a starting point. Bilingualism in Canada is institutional bilingualism. People are not expected to speak two languages. Institutions are expected to speak two languages. I think it's a very wise policy. It's a good policy so your post office speaks two languages, your parliament speaks two languages, any institution of a federal, that is to say the overriding political structure, speaks two languages. People very often do not. So even in Quebec, you have francophones. Quebec, by the way, we have a very baroque language system. So the federal system is bilingual, but the provinces, of which there are 10, have their own policies. And Quebec, for instance, is unilingual French. So I live in a city which I think is functionally bilingual, in a province that is unilingual, in a country that is bilingual. So you can imagine and in a neighborhood which is extremely multilingual. So here you're absolutely right in saying that. So that bilingual structure occupies only, let's say, one corner of our existences, the official corner of our existences that has to do with communications policy, it has to do with education policy. It's important. It occupies a lot of our life. But what happens on the sidewalk and in buses and on street corners is a very different situation. So we have, for instance, in Montreal, you'll hear conversations where you'll hear a lot of Russian these days because there are many Russian immigrants. In my neighborhood, we have Greek, Italian, Portuguese, and in a neighborhood not too far from me, you will hear a great deal of Punjabi because there's the neighborhood called Park Extension, which is just a few minutes from my neighborhood, is one of the neighborhoods with the most intense percentage of recent immigrants, among them many, many South Asians. So that's where we go to have wonderful veg tallies is in that neighborhood.
Yeah. Multilingualism has its advantages, right?
Yes.
So this connects to something that you have written elsewhere, and I'll come back to that later. That so in a way, Canada is visually bilingual, but orally, that
Yes.
you listen many more than just the two dominant languages. But
absolutely, that's
yeah. Okay, since we are on that, let me take up that question first. You know, you have said something very interesting about reading a city or understanding a city, that very often we understand a city by looking at its monuments, its architecture, etc. But you said a city is much more than its visuals, that one has to listen to a city, right? So, I mean, what is this notion of listening, and what does listening tell us about cities?
Yes, thanks for that question. There's such a disconnect I have found in the literature on cities between that visual and oral thing. You know, Barcelona is a really important city for urban studies. You know, it has the history of Gaudi and history of urban planning, and there's so much written about that city. And yet you can read books and books and books about the city without anybody mentioning the fact that on the streets you hear two languages. And these two languages are very much in conflict, and that is Spanish and Catalan. And once you understand what's going on the street, because if you're a foreigner and you don't really get it, you can just see and not hear. But once you grasp that particular music and understand the history that it refers to, as well as the conflicts that it today leads to, you really experience the city completely differently. You hear it as a place of that promotes a certain kind of conviviality, a certain sensuality of languages meeting, but also a particular kind of tension. For instance, in Montreal, where we have English and French all the time, an insider knows that when you go to the store or when you're in any kind of transaction, the first thing that your interlocutor is waiting for is to hear which language you're speaking. And once they figure that out, a lot of things follow from that. So there's a tension in every single interaction on the street. When I often go jogging we have a park that's called the Mountain. I go jogging, and if you want to make a joke, you pass somebody going both ways. You know, you have to make a decision. Which language am I going to say it in? And if I say it in the wrong language, they won't laugh because they won't get the joke. So, or they will because they know both languages, but especially a joke, you know, it has to be in the right language. So there's a kind of, all the relationships in the city are colored by the fact that there's this question always, which language and what does that language represent? So there's a tension on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a great richness because you have these two different histories or several histories that are constantly mingling. And you also have different perspectives on the city. Who has said what? Which history do you belong to or do you want to subscribe to? So I think about research on cities. So I've looked at, you know, several cities in Europe and in Asia. If you look at Calcutta and the history of colonial Calcutta, and you read a book about, let's say, the 1880s in Calcutta, what is the story that is being told there, and which perspective, which language is that story being told in? Because if the story is told in English, it will be one story. And of course, if it's told in Bengali, it would be quite a different one, or in several other different possible languages. So the actual historical archive of a city is compartmentalized linguistically. And, you know, really good books, really good historical books are those that are able to tap into a wide variety of sources to read all the narratives that have been told, to read them in English and in Bengali and in Hindi and whatever languages. So that the city is a composite of languages at the same time.
Yeah, in fact, what you said about books on cities is so accurate, because very often we have books on cities, some excellent books on cities, and we have excellent books on translation, but rarely do they actually talk to each other. I mean, the books talk to each other, but in your writing, you constantly bring these two things together. And, I quote from your book where you say, translation is a powerful framework for reading cities and buildings smothered in layers of language. So how do cities, or where do cities and translation intersect? And how does the study of one enrich our insight into the other?
Thank you. Okay. So I'll go back to my city, Montreal, which is where this kind of insight, I can't even say I discovered it. It's so omnipresent. So Montreal is a city that translated itself from the 1960s. So at first, this was a city that, or at first in my childhood, because it was first for me, it was a very divided city, as I said. And English and French remained very distant one from the other. And in the 1960s, the city became was animated by the spirit of what at the time was called French Canadian nationalism, and the French Canadian bourgeoisie was able to establish itself politically, economically, and the city switched in the space of sort of 10, 15 years. The city went from being considered an English-speaking city to becoming a French language city. It was a city that translated itself. But it didn't translate itself only at an official level. Of course, there were hundreds of acts of translation that made this possible or that accompanied this shift. And I became very interested in following translators, literary translators who were part of this shift, whose projects reflected this shift, which was a very, very exciting time, because it was a time when Quebec literature became very vibrant, and in literature, in song, in poetry, this was extremely exciting. So that was a kind of a template for me of looking at how translation was a movement of cultural history. This wasn't just an act of scholarly drudgery. This was a movement where something happened, and there was a cultural transformation that was a shift across languages. And this marked not only what happens in books, but what happens on the street. So street names changed, buildings were reinterpreted. Something that had been considered a symbol of Englishness became a symbol of Frenchness, or remained English but was excluded, or all different kinds of acts of translation and reinterpretation, renaming took place. So this became, as I said, a template for me to look at other cities, and I realized how certain cities have this power of carry these memories of other languages in them. And you can explore the richness of a city by looking at these kinds of shifts, and not only in books, but in the very streets. So as I mentioned, Barcelona is another city that has had many back and forth movements of translation, and its architecture reflects this, its literature reflects this. One of my favorite fetish cities is Trieste in Italy, which has a fascinating history of crossing languages from the German of the Habsburg Empire to the Italian of the language that it became in 1918, and the languages of the Slavic languages, Slovenian and Croatian, which are next door. But to me, I think the most poignant examples of cities that have experienced translation are those of Eastern Europe. And there, it's less a story of, well, there are stories of excitement, but there are so many stories of loss.
Yeah.
And suppression, and how languages were victims of murderous changes that took place over the 20th century. So those are also stories of translation.
You know, while going through your work, I felt that the three key words that recur in your work are city, language, and memory.
Yes.
And if probably one can add history, right? But these three keywords, keep recurring in your work. So please, tell us the connections among these words. City, language, and memory.
So, in the kind of cities that I'm mentioning, so all cities are multilingual. All cities are also translational in meaning that languages are always in flux and meeting and encountering one another. Some cities in particular, language is equivalent to memory. Languages are memories. If you take a city like, this is a fascinating city of Eastern Europe, today called Lviv, but many people will remember it as a city called Lemberg. Lemberg is a much better known, let's say, historical word. So it was a German city, but it was a German city which was for a long time Polish. And then it became a city of Ukraine. It was also a city with a huge Jewish population whose main language was Yiddish. Those languages in that city, so Polish in today's Lviv, is a language of memory. It's a language that evokes a particular period, a very rich period of Polish history, also a very dramatic and tragic period because it ended with the Second World War. But language is memory. Yiddish is a language of memory in Eastern Europe. But memory, and this is where the city comes in, and very, very strongly, for the language to be a memory, for it to take its place as a memory, it has to be fought for. It has to be fought for and represented by a community. So for many, many years in when this area was under Soviet control, there was no memory because no one was allowed to be there to defend this memory. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Jewish memory is allowed to re-enter the city, to take its place in the city. And it's so important to see those languages actually inscribed in the city. So whether it be on park benches or in memorials or on street corners as street names or plaques, those are so important because they show that the city was once, that was the language that you heard on those streets. And another question is, who does a city belong to? What is the memory of a city? Who does the memory belong to? So in a city like some of the Eastern European cities I'm discussing, Lviv or Vilnius is another one in Lithuania. The population of those cities today are mainly people who arrived after the Second World War. There was so much displacement. So the history of the city is separate from the people who live there. Who does that history belong to? Does it belong to the people who live there and they can just go tabula rasa and forget that memory? Or is there a way for the people who live there now to say, no, this place was once a place where there was a huge Jewish population, and this should be recognized, and we will allow these languages to appear again on the streets.
About renaming of cities in Central Europe, you said something which resonated so much with what is happening now. Of course, you talked about cities. This is what you said, and I quote: "Each renaming in the 20th century is a form of violence." Right. You talked about the cities, but I was also thinking in recent times of, in India too, we are in, we have this, massive renaming of cities and so on.
Yes.
And more recently, for example, not just a city, but one particular monument, the Hagia Sophia Museum in Istanbul, which is changed from a museum to a mosque. And originally it was a cathedral, right? So this kind of renaming in a way, or repurposing, as what we are today talking about. So I mean, what does this indicate to you? When you said that every renaming is a form of violence.
Yes. Yes. Well, there. Forms of nationalism make renaming, consider renaming is a way of making a place more fully itself, that will reflect more fully its real reality. So, Bangalore is really, really Bengaluru because that's its inner sense, and that's the meaning that that city will take. It's hard to look at situations that one might feel sympathy for, as opposed to situations that one knows, are forms of violence. So clearly in Eastern Europe, we're talking about forms of violence because they were accompanied by armed violence. These were results of armed conflict. So that is kind of goes without saying. One person's idea of what the truth is often will conflict with the idea, someone else's idea. I think that renaming is also inevitable. Part of, we don't always naming always comes with power. So naming is always a form of power. So, Christopher Columbus arriving in North America said, this is going to be called this, and this will be called that. And this was his form of power. Renaming is the same sort of operation. And in certain cases, of course, people will see that as the triumph of a particular form of usually linguistic nationalism. And linguistic nationalism is a positive force, can be a positive force, and can be a negative force. I think there's no way of saying it's one thing.
Would you say that this is what you use the phrase counter-translation? because you said translation can be an instrument of suppression, whereas counter-translation can bring languages back into circulation. So some of these would be somewhat like the counter-translation that you are talking about.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a kind of an inevitable movement, a kind of pendulum of history. So on the one hand, translation as an instrument of violence. On the other hand, translation as an instrument of re-emergence. And we see that so clearly in North America now with First Nations languages, where these languages are being translated into new realities and new life. So yes, counter-translation is that movement that sees a suppression. So again, when I talk about Yiddish in Lviv, this is a movement of counter-translation, when a language that has been suppressed and eliminated is, reemerges, but again, through communities of action. That is the only way that these memories and these new identities can reemerge.
So it's a kind of a reinstituting of memory through a community's remembrance.
Yes. Well, we see that so strongly, as I said, with First Nations languages, which are, and First Nations culture in North America, which has seen just an amazing, remarkable resurgence in the last 10, 20 years, language teaching, but also, again, the physical presence of languages in institutions. So I was very struck recently by the actions that were taken by our National Gallery, our most important art gallery in Ottawa, which only 1 or 2 years ago reimagined its entire collection to start not with European art, but with First Nations art, which of course was long overdue, and accompanied that with labeling in Indigenous languages, which was something that seems like it should be normal, and yet it was a tremendous act of reinscribing languages in public places. So that idea of public place, of language taking its place where it should be, that was very remarkable.
Tell us about your choice of places that you write about in this book. You have public spaces largely. You have taken hotels, bridges, gardens, museums, etc. So what went into the choice of these specific places, and why did you choose them? And what do they tell us about this entire translation process?
Yes. Well, I define translation sites as places which tell stories of translation, which tell stories of language and language movement across languages, conversations across languages in very different ways. In fact, each of the places I speak about is a different kind of place and involves a different kind of translation. So my goal was not to construct any, not to construct a museum of places, but a field guide of translation. So theoretically, it's open and infinite, and you can find your own translation places. I think that if I had a goal, it would be that reading this, readers would say, oh yes, I know, I have my own list of translation sites. And so I'm hoping that this is less a choice of places than it is a method of reading or a way of seeing places as having, as showing these dialogues. So some of them were architecture. I think this is simply because I've become fascinated with architecture and the stories that architecture tells. These days we're fascinated with starchitects and how these buildings reflect someone's individual personality. I'm more interested in the stories architecture tells about the past and about how history is perceived in the present. I talk about 2 opera houses in Prague, for instance, one which was built as a Czech opera house, the other was built as a German opera house, and how both of them have changed and been translated today, and how they exist very differently in the city. Or the architecture of, in Spain, how an architecture of a mosque becomes a church and then goes back to being a mosque or a synagogue, and how those histories are so much histories of translation as well as forced translation in Spain. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul would be a very, very interesting translation site, and indeed it has been very much transformed. I'm interested in the how places tell us about small and large differences. So sometimes differences seem to be very small. The difference between Spanish and Catalan is very small, seems like a very small difference, and yet they reveal very huge differences of history and conflict. And this is reflected again in the way that we perceive the realities of the cities and the sites. The bridge is a fascinating site of translation. The bridge has long been associated with, translation is called a bridge in an optimistic way, and yet this bridge can be problematic. So I talk, for instance, about the Mostar Bridge in Bosnia, which is a very, very beautiful bridge, which was built in the 16th century, but became a focal point of conflict in the Bosnian War in 1993, and it was destroyed, only to be rebuilt as a symbol of the reunification of Bosnia. However, as we know, that is not such a successful reunification. And it is fascinating to see that this reunification, though the bridge was rebuilt, the languages fragmented. So before Yugoslavia was destroyed or came to an end, the regime, the Yugoslav regime, there was one language called Serbo-Croat. Today, there are 3 languages called Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian. And Bosnian is the language that would have been spoken on this Mostar Bridge. And whereas translation was not necessary before, now it is necessary. So translation, or the bridge, becomes a symbol of something that's not necessarily positive. Translation has become necessary where it wasn't before.
Yeah, the bridge is such an interesting symbol to talk about translation because it faces both ways. And
yes,
and
that's
also
right. It faces both ways.
and
yes.
also because you yourself have written that translation, a translated text is actually composed of double realities. And in a beautiful sentence, you say that it offers 2 realities for the price of 1.
Yes.
So because
I actually, yeah. That's a quote from Anne
yeah.
Carson, the poet Anne Carson. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because a translated text constantly, makes us realize another text which isn't there. right?
That's right. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
So
Yes.
the presence constantly indicates the absence.
That's absolutely right. Anne Carson, who's internationally famous poet now, who's originally Canadian, speaks of the left-hand page. So she's a classical poet, and a scholar. So she's used to reading bilingual editions, and she says she's used to her eyes moving from one to the other. So the left hand is the original, the right hand is the translation. But she says, we live in a world of right-hand pages where the left-hand page has disappeared. So we're faced with that confusing, that rich, but also confusing right-hand page. And there's no left-hand page for us to refer to if we want to know, what is the real meaning of this? What is the real meaning of what I'm trying to figure out? Well, we won't know. The original is forever gone.
Yeah. And also, I think the last two questions that I would like you to quickly comment on is a comment that you make, I think, in the introduction to the book, where you interpret an exhibition in France, and you interpret its message as translations have shaped history, and more than ever, they have an impact on contemporary cities. So, I thought that's a huge statement to make about how translations have, made histories or shaped histories. So, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, that's a huge. I think it's I like to, when I teach, I like to begin with, the fact that, for instance, the history of Bible translation. If you look at the history of Bible translation, you look at the history of religion, you see the history of religion is a history of translations. If you look at the voyages of Hinduism, if you look at the voyages of Buddhism, through South Asia, these are histories of translation and rewriting. So the history of religion is a history of translation. The history of nationalism is a history of translation. I'm fascinated with this moment in 1918 where cities were transformed from often very, cosmopolitan places into national places. So Alexandria went from being a cosmopolitan city to a national one. Salonika went from being an international place to a national one. And so, the history of nationalism worldwide is a story of translation, because so often nationalism is accompanied by, this importance for language to reveal and express one particular reality. So I think it's not very difficult to prove, that translation pervades history, but we don't often see it that way. We don't often understand it that way.
Yeah, I think one city that I would like you to tell us a little bit more about, because it's a very fascinating city, which is Nicosia in Cyprus. It's a
Yes.
very, it's unusual to see a city being divided into two languages, with border guards and everything. And I was also thinking about, when we talk about cities and translation, cities, the moment you say a city, you also think about its boundaries, its borders. And translation is a way of transgressing those borders. And Nicosia, please, because you write about that in this book. So do tell us about Nicosia and what, as a translator, you see that city as.
It's interesting that poets from Nicosia, from Cyprus, are very engaged with translation, because situations of violence are not the opposite of translation. We might think that the translation is necessarily a peaceable activity, but situations of violence actually create the necessity for translation and enhance its importance. So in a situation of tension like that of Nicosia, where you have two languages that are separated physically in this way, translation takes on sort of an immense symbolic value. And there are poets, and when I talk about Nicosia, I talk about a workshop that took place there in a place called the Dead Zone, that is to say, in that intermediate place between the two cities, which poets have tried to reclaim and use as a site of translation. And they very optimistically hope to bring the two languages together again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, through this idea of stepmother tongue.
Right.
So looking at languages not as pure varieties, Greek, Turkish, but looking at the stepmother tongue, which is a kind of a mixture of the two languages that has been developed and that is purely Cypriot. But it is, you know, these situations are sad. And that's where the affect of language and the emotions that come out of this history of violence and the ruins, the physical ruins that one sees, these are immensely affecting sites of translation.
Yeah, and I would like to end by asking you a question similarly about Calcutta. That, of course, you write about in the earlier book, because there you talk about translation not merely as language, but also translating genres, translating subjectivities, etc. So let us end with Calcutta.
I was extremely lucky to be able to go back to Calcutta last year with a group of people who were actually studying the various languages in the city. And I learned so much about the histories of different language communities in the city. My book, I was focused on two languages, English and Bengali, because those were the sources that I was able to work with. And in a sense, I was at odds with, the tremendously rich multilingual history of Kolkata, which is fascinating. But the period that I was talking about, the Bengali Renaissance, which of course everyone in India is very familiar with, was a spectacular movement of translation, which just infiltrated every area of intellectual and creative life, and colored the city in fantastically interesting and palpable ways, so that life in Kolkata during that period, Amitav Ghosh speaks about how science was created through, Amitav Ghosh has spoken about many things, but
yes.
Especially about how medical science was developed during that period in Bengali as a movement of translation, as do many others who talk about go-betweens. And so we often look at literature and as translation is a movement between one text and another, but science, commerce, these were all very influenced by translation. And one of the most beautiful outcomes of this movement of translation was the creation of the novel form itself in the Bengali language.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take a few questions from the audience now. The first question that I see is from Giridhar Rao, who asks, Montreal is also Len Cohen's city. he too was
Yes.
someone who lived between languages, wasn't he?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, Leonard Cohen is what is fabulous in Montreal, that Leonard Cohen started out as a Jewish boy from English Montreal. And when he died, he was a citizen of Montreal, adored by all the population of Montreal. He was translated. He became a francophone in the sense that francophone Montrealers were absolutely in love with him, just as his own community, that small community that I mentioned, I was part of, became, dissolved into the larger community, and the expressions of love and respect. And we now have some fabulous murals, so that when you walk downtown, again, talking about, memory and how it exists on the spaces of the city. So you see Leonard Cohen, and he's there. He's a presence looking over the city, and yet he also became, a star of international renown. So he's a fabulous example of how he evolved with Montreal and Montreal with him.
And Akanksha asks this question: is the fall of statues in Black Lives Matter an act of violence or dissent or reclaiming power? How do we look at violence in such a situation? Can it also be seen as counter-translation?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Of course, I think we all agree that that oppressive histories and the huge history of racism means we must reclaim monuments that we destroy in order to reclaim. So violence is a necessary moment there, and yes, this very much is counter-translation. In the context of the United States, we don't see it so much as a linguistic phenomenon because because of the particular history of the United States, they have had a way of suppressing its very, very multilingual past. There have been scholars who argue for a recognition of the many languages of the United States and how these should be recognized. But the overwhelming narrative of the United States is of a monolingual country. And so we don't see these episodes as language episodes. But I can't, I can only say that, of course, we must oppose the history of racism, and we must get rid of those horrible statues. Yes.
Yeah. You about naming coming with power. Of course, you are familiar with the formulation in post-colonial studies where we say naming is taming. And a question related to that is by Y.L. Srinivas, who asks, if naming comes with power, renaming could be the result of resistance. In which case, can we call it violence?
Yeah, yes, I think, yeah, one defines violence by the side you're on, and I think that any naming and any renaming will be, they are acts which attempt to define an entity coming to express itself better. So what is the reality of an entity? Whose name is most appropriate for that entity? And that's where the notion of community comes in. So communities must rename themselves, and the power must come from the community, which reclaims its own identity.
Yeah, but if if by community, if we mean the majority community, right, which by its sheer capacity for power undertakes that kind of a renaming, right? Does it
Yes.
also not constitute violence, not necessarily in the physical terms, but a kind of a violence in terms of history, in terms of community memory? Yeah.
Yes. Violence is not far from the kinds of movements that we're talking about if we're talking about disruption.
Mm.
So disruption means interrupting the status quo, interrupting what has been accepted as the you know, the majority or the conventional form of truth. So these forms, these moments are necessary disruptions.
Mm.
Whether they come with physical violence or it's very different if they do or they don't. Can changes be made without the kind of physical violence that we deplore? Of course, that would be the end goal.
Yeah. One more question. He has asked several questions. Let me just ask one of them. As language is an inseparable part of a particular culture, the conflict among multiple languages in a multilingual cities appears to me as the conflict among cultures. The conflict of cultures is expressed in the form of languages. In that context, do we have to consider the tension between the languages as conflict of cultures? You have said very in more than one book that whenever we talk about multilingualism, very often we ignore the asymmetries of power. You know, we talk about multilingualism as if you know, all languages are existing on the same footing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Which of course is not true. So,
Right.
so conflict of languages in a multilingual society, can they actually be considered conflict of cultures?
Yes, well, we know that the idea of culture is a difficult one, and to actually, you know, define it. But yes, of course, I would say that it is, because languages are do not exist in themselves. They are vehicles of, they are actually the, you know, the very matter with which we through which we exist, and very much the sensations that we live, and even the very atmosphere that we breathe. So languages are very much part of our realities, and so languages are always conflicts of culture, for sure. And I like that you remind me that this, you know, that multilingualism is often a let's just say a feel-good term, and I like to oppose the multilingualism with the idea of translational, because when we talk about translation, if we understand it in the ways that we've been discussing now, where one language replaces another, or there is, you know, a constant struggle, and where the languages are looking to incorporate themselves into a particular community. If you look at a city and you just say, okay, there are 100 languages there, you have said nothing. What you have to look at is how those languages relate one to the other. Who is connecting? Are Bengalis speaking to Swahili people? Are probably not. More likely Bengali is relating to English, Swahili to English. These are the ways that the languages are themselves connecting. So the main point to me is connection. So the connectional city, I could have called it. I called it translational, but I could have called it the connectional city, the incorporative city. How do these languages come together to form a common discourse and make a city, a community?
Yeah. And since I began by asking you a couple of personal questions, let me also end by asking you a couple of questions. Have you ever, of course, you have studied translation, but have you ever tried your hand at translation itself?
I actually have one of my, what can I say, my moments of glory. I actually translated the essays of Michel Foucault. Years and years ago, as a student, I was asked to help out in that. So I did. That is a published translation of mine, which are the essays of beautiful essays. They're less well known than his books, but he wrote literary essays. And it's a volume of they're very, very lovely. And yes, I translate as a matter of course. Actually, I translate when I'm teaching. I translate literary translation, and I've had a few projects here and there. I love translation.
And how, since we are talking about connections, how do you see these two connecting with each other? I mean, translation as an activity, translation and translation studies as an academic discipline. Where do they come together, and is there anything that one can learn from the other, and where do they connect? Basically, how do they interact with each other?
I love that question because I think they interact so fundamentally. So translation is about difference. How different is one language from another? When you're translating, how different is that reality from this other reality? Translators constantly have to answer that question. How different? Same, different. If I'm translating road, if I have the word road, is it going to be a road, or am I going to have to translate it into another variety of local understanding of what a road is? So always how different. So there was a time when, if you talk about translating differences of huge civilizational differences between South Pacific languages or between, Breton and indigenous languages, how big are how distant is the route that will take you from one language to another? And in translation studies, you're also asking the same question. How different is one reality from another? How does difference become part of our discussion on a street corner? How different is your neighbor from yourself? How different are the different communities in the city from one another? There was a time when, Eastern European immigrants were considered astonishingly different from the natives of, the white settlers. Now they're, who cares? The difference has shifted. Difference becomes politicized. Difference is not simply, physical, because we shift those differences all the time. They become ideological, they become religious. So difference is I think the operative word there, and how we gauge difference and how we deal with it.
I think one way in which I can see the impact of the processes of translation, as you call them, impacting and being relevant to our present day situation, is precisely this idea of engaging with difference. I think translation constantly makes us engage with difference, and that entire process of translation, I think, is so important in our today's world, right? That
Yes.
way, I can see the translation studies or translation as an activity being extremely relevant for us today.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And once again, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I thank you once again for taking time to join this session of HLF. And thank you once again, and all the very best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. They were really very lovely. This has been a very delightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of today's session. Let me remind you that we will be back on 4th of September with another session, a conversation with Michael Bass on his latest book, Muscular India. This is about masculinity and mobility and the new middle class. This is a book that has come out just last week, and we'll be in conversation with Michael Bass. This is on 4th of September. Before I leave you, let me once again remind you to subscribe to the HLF channel and click on the bell button, bell icon, so that you get notified every time we have a session online. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you very much, Sherry, for joining us this evening. Thank you.